Hello, everyone. I want to talk to you guys about how the Europeans are preparing for a second Trump presidency. And really, before this whole shooting took place, the Europeans were talking about how they have been increasing their military spending, really to appeal to Donald Trump. And they were talking about, well, in the case of a Trump presidency, well, after this shooting, I must say, after Donald Trump getting shot at and his ear getting grazed by a bullet, I must say that now the Europeans are really going to start anticipating a Trump presidency, because that shooting really sealed the deal for a second Trump presidency. Donald Trump stated that if Russia went to war against an EU country, and that EU country was not spending at least 2% of its GDP on its military, that the American government would not help that EU country. A lot of these EU countries are now spending 2% of their GDPs on their defense. They're trying to appeal to Donald Trump. They're not talking about trying to appeal to Biden, because what's there to appeal to Biden? Angela Merkel said, we really can't trust the British. We really can't trust the Americans. So what's really happening? What's happening is the rise of Germany. Now, there is already a Fourth Reich. It's an economic Reich, but Germany is not a military Reich. Not yet. I look at the news and I ask myself, are the Europeans trying to appeal to a second Biden presidency, or are they trying to appeal to a second Trump presidency? Well, the latter of the two is the correct answer, because that is what the Europeans are doing. The Europeans are talking about how much of their GDPs they are spending on their militaries, because they're trying to appeal to Donald Trump, almost as if they think that Donald Trump is going to win, or they believe that it is very likely that Donald Trump is going to win, given the fact that Biden introduced Zelensky as Putin.
And now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin.
Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. And remember, that NATO meeting was supposed to be a test for Biden's fitness. I think that Biden had a Freudian slip, because the Americans know that Putin will be the president of parts of Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine, Crimea. Well, he's already the president of Crimea. Effectively, he is the president of the Donbass region and Crimea. I remember talking to a guy who lives in Luhansk, and he told me, he said, if you came to Donbass, you wouldn't think that there's a war going on. He said that this is Russia. Russian soldiers are all over the place. Russian security is all over the place. This is Russia. He said, Putin is our president. And that's that. Zelensky is not our president. This is not Ukraine. This is Russia. Biden shows that he is just not really fit for the presidency, and everyone sees this. This is a very conspicuous thing to see. And the Democrats are acting like they're ashamed of him. They're acting like they're embarrassed of Biden. And you see these articles coming out, especially in the New York Times, about how this Democrat or that Democrat has come out to say that Biden should leave the race, that Biden should not run for the presidency. And there is this whole discussion on whether or not Biden is going to drop from the race. Now, if Biden does not drop from the race and he loses, they can say, well, it wasn't the Democrat Party. It was Biden's arrogance that ruined it for us. And politics is theater. It's all show. There's some sort of a theater. There's some sort of a show that's being directed here, in my estimation. That's why you see all these articles coming out. This Democrat says Biden should drop. This Democrat says Biden should drop. It's all just a big show, in my opinion. It's all just a big show, so that if Biden loses, then they'll say, well, it was this arrogant man that ruined it all, blah, 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 blah. The forecast, the political weather forecast is telling us that Trump is going to win. That's what the political weather forecast is saying. And you have all these European leaders saying, Trump, look at what we're doing. We're appealing to you. We're doing what you want. We're trying to placate you. We're spending all this money from our GDPs on our militaries. Now, why are they doing this? Because some time ago, Donald Trump stated that if Russia went to war against an EU country, and that EU country was not spending at least 2% of its GDP on its military, that the American government would not help that EU country. So all these EU countries are now spending 2% of their GDP. Not all the EU countries, but a lot of these EU countries are now spending 2% of their GDPs on their defense. They're trying to appeal to Donald Trump. They're not talking about trying to appeal to Biden, because what's there to appeal to Biden? He's not even really ruling. There's no way this guy is ruling anything. I just refuse to believe that. The guy, he's introducing Zelensky as Putin, and then he says, I would not have chosen Vice President Trump if she wasn't fit for the job. He referred to Donald Trump as a she. He referred to Kamala Harris as Donald Trump. And I remember thinking to myself, it's 2024. So they're referring to Trump as a she because of this whole trans hysteria. It's so funny. So what's there to appeal to? There's nothing there. There's no ruler. The king has no clothes. Now, AP News did an article on how these Europeans are trying to placate and please Donald Trump, and I'm going to read to you guys some excerpts from it. So it says here, European allies and NATO are stepping up their military spending just as Donald Trump wanted, not as Biden wanted. Now remember, Biden stated that the European countries should be spending 2% of their GDPs on their defense. But they're not saying we're trying to appeal to Biden. They're talking about pleasing Donald Trump, making Trump happy. And the article goes on to say they're pointing to common interests such as concerns over China. In words, deeds, and arms deals, leaders of the United States, partners in NATO are making the case for the military alliance in ways likely to appeal to the presumptive Republican presidential nominee. At the NATO summit, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg made a point of saying that allies had gotten Trump's message, with the record 23 of the 32 now spending at least the agreed upon 2% of their gross domestic product on their militaries. The United States has been understood. Allies have acted, Stoltenberg declared in response to one of many questions about a possible Trump withdrawal from NATO. Lithuanian Defense Minister Laurynas Kasčiūnas ticked off the priorities that his country would share with Trump if he returns to the White House, making European defense more self-reliant, buying more U.S. weapons, and thus generating more business for the U.S. arms industry, confronting perceived security threats to the West from China, and sanctioning Iran. Now, they're talking a lot about China because Trump is fixated on China. The Americans are shifting their focus more on China than they are on Europe. So just as Donald Trump said, let someone else deal with Syria, and that someone else was Turkey, the United States is eventually going to say, let someone else deal with Ukraine, and that someone else is going to be Germany. And so the Americans are basically giving the mantle of defender of Europe to the Germans. And remember what Trump tried to do when he was president. He wanted to pull out 1/3 of U.S. troops from Germany. 1/3. Now, all of this... Now, it didn't happen. It did not happen. But all of this rhetoric, all of this isolationist, nativist, non-interventionist rhetoric that came from Donald Trump spurred the Germans to start working on their own military. And it got the Germans to start expressing themselves in ways that they had not really expressed themselves in normal times, in times of normality. They were talking about how they couldn't really trust the Americans anymore. Angela Merkel said this back in, 2017, 2018? She said, we can no longer really trust the Americans, and the Brits, by the way. She said we can no longer really trust the British because the British had left the European Union. Now, why would that cause distrust between the British and the Germans? Well, because by leaving the EU, the British have essentially freed themselves of the obligation of taking part in a war to defend the European Union. Because the British, are they really European? I've heard the opinion that Britain is not really Europe. I mean, it's Europe, but it's not, right? It's kind of its own little continent. And it's an island. So geographically, and I should say psychologically, it is separate from Europe. And so if you have this massive war going on in Europe, Britain sort of has this liberty of, not entirely, but it sort of has this liberty of looking from a distance and saying, well, cheerio. And by leaving the EU, Britain really freed itself from an obligation to join a pan-European military force if it decides not to join such a force. After Brexit, Angela Merkel said, we really can't trust the British. We really can't trust the Americans. So what's really happening? What's happening is the rise of Germany. That's what's happening. It's the rise of Germany as a major power. Now, there is already a Fourth Reich. It's an economic Reich. It's Germany running Europe because it's the biggest economy. But Germany is not a military Reich. Not yet. At least not yet. So all this talk of Trump talking about leaving Germany, pulling troops out of Germany, all of this talk spurred Germany into an aspiration for military independence. And so what's happening? What's happening is the revival of German power. It is the revival of a Reich, the idea of the German Reich. All this talk from Trump, such as when Trump said, if an EU country is ever attacked by Russia and that EU country is not really paying its fair share, we're not going to help them. In fact, we're going to encourage the Russians to attack that country. Well, that type of rhetoric gives a further green light to the Germans to become militarily independent. And I believe that this is what the Americans want ultimately. Because the Americans, like I said, they want to shift their focus on China. China is the biggest enemy because China has the second biggest economy in the world. China has the second biggest economy in the world. And so America is focused on what is the god of America? The god of America is money. It's the greenback. And that is the god of the United States. Hell, we put God on the dollar. We put God on our currency. God. We have God on the currency because our God, well, not my God, but the God of the American elites, the American upper echelons of power, Manhattan, Wall Street, whatever, the God of that America is money. And so what is Russia? Right, economically speaking, what is Russia? Russia is a very powerful country militarily, but not economically, although that is changing. The GDP of Russia is roughly around the same as the GDP of Texas. So Russia is not the biggest threat economically speaking. China is. So the Americans are saying, well, we have to focus on China. Well, what about Europe? What about Ukraine? Let someone else handle it. And that someone else is Germany. And that's why they're talking about building a new military base in Wiesbaden, Germany, to train Ukrainians. Why is this? And when they were talking about building this base in Germany, they were also talking about Trump-proofing NATO because they are anticipating a non-interventionist America. Because as I have said many times, America is exhausted from war. They're tired with war. They don't want to deal with war. They don't want to hear the term troops on the ground. They don't want to see Lindsey Graham. They don't want to see another John McCain walking around. They don't want that. They don't want it. And I can't blame them. Who the hell wants to go to war? We just want to sit around, look at our phones, and look at cat videos. We don't want to go to war. So let someone else deal with it. And that someone else needs to be someone who's actually near Russia. Well, Germany is pretty close to Russia, right? It's close to Kaliningrad, which is a Russian enclave in Europe. Poland borders with Russia because Poland borders with Kaliningrad. And Germany borders with Poland. Now, what I foresee, and I could be wrong, but what I foresee is not really a fully united Europe. I foresee division in Europe. You see, the Europeans, they were really divided during COVID. They couldn't even really unite during COVID. The poor European countries like Italy were saying, hey, we need some help because of COVID. We need some COVID money. And the Germanic countries were saying, well, we're not really going to give you aid money, but we can give you some more loans to get you deeper into debt. So they're not really a super united country. Poland made a law against abortion. It has done legislation against the LGBT movement, and that has pissed off the Germans. I mean, it's not a really united country. And my prediction, my prognostication, is that Europe will further be divided and polarized in the future. And you have this vying between Poland and Germany. this vying between Poland and Germany. In fact, there has been this judicial conflict between the Germans and the Poles that's been going on for years. Within recent years, Poland said, we're going to lower the retirement age for Supreme Court judges. They lowered the retirement age, and then they began to throw out Supreme Court judges that were not conservative, Supreme Court judges that were sort of the residue of communism. And then they began to appoint judges that were more conservative. Now, as a conservative Christian myself, I don't really see this as a bad thing. But according to the Germans, this is a violation of judicial law within the EU. And so they're beginning to treat, or they have really been treating Poland as almost a rogue state within the European Union. Now, the thing about Poland is that Poland is a powerful country in the EU. It is spending more on military, more on defense than any other EU country. So Poland is aspiring to become the biggest military country in the European Union. And I think that a lot of these Europeans, they see Poland as the first line of defense in the case of a Russian war in Central Europe. The thing with that is that these very Europeans also see Poland as cannon fodder. That's how they see Poland, as cannon fodder. But Germany is vying to become the defender of Europe. So is Germany going to allow Poland to become the biggest military? That's the question. Could we one day see an inter-European war between EU countries? That's another thought. That's another thought to keep in mind. But all this talk from Trump about not helping a particular EU country, all of this talk gives a further justification to the Germans to make their military strong again. And they're trying to build a military culture. That's why they brought back Veterans Day in Germany. The Germans have not had a Veterans Day since Hitler was running the show. And who's to say that one day the Germans are not going to be praising the Wehrmacht? Germany right now is in an indirect war with Russia. Did not the Wehrmacht fight the Russians? And did not the Wehrmacht fight communist Russians? So why shouldn't we be praising the Wehrmacht? This is going to be the argument, I think, in the future. Why should we not be praising the Wehrmacht? We have a Veterans Day, so let's honor the Wehrmacht because they fought the Russians just like we're dealing with the Russians right now. And what's happening in Europe? The Scandinavian countries have agreed to unite all of their air forces together, so they want to make this massive air force. And Finland borders with the Kola Peninsula, which is a Russian peninsula. It borders right with it. That means that Finland is smack right next to the Russian Navy. I was thinking about this last night. I think there's going to be a ceasefire in Ukraine. And I think eventually that ceasefire will be broken, as are all ceasefires, almost all ceasefires. And fighting will resume. And I can see this happening. I'm not saying this is going to happen 100%, but I can see the Europeans saying, we have to deal with this Russian problem. We have to get rid of this problem once and for all. And the Europeans are going to attack Russia from two different sides. They're going to attack the northern part of Russia through Scandinavia, just like the Germans and their Finnish allies in World War II attacked the Soviet Union, and they're going to attack Russia from the south. And maybe from other angles, I don't know, but I think they're going to do some sort of a scissor effect or a pincer effect on Russia. I could see this happening. And it's going to be like Operation Barbarossa all over again. Trench warfare, tanks, Air Force, airplanes, the whole thing. And there's going to be drones and all that stuff, obviously. But I foresee a future Russo-Germanic war. I'm not saying it's going to happen next year, but I foresee it happening. I foresee it happening. And I'm going to read some more excerpts from this article here. So it says here that... Now, before I read it, I just remembered something. Remember what Zelensky said. He said, I want to know what Trump's plan is. I want to know what Trump's plan is. He said, are we going to have to lose territory? Now, why would Zelensky say that? Why would he say, Trump, are we going to have to lose territory? As if to say, listen, I know that if you win, there's going to be a negotiation, and I just want to know I want to know right now, are we going to have to cede territory to the Russians? Because that's what's going to happen. And maybe, just maybe, Biden had a Freudian slip when he said, ladies and gentlemen, President Putin, because the Americans know that that Putin will be the president of some parts of Ukraine. So going on with this article here, here's the last excerpt that I highlighted here. But Trump has warned more often and more loudly, and during the current campaign, he has threatened to invite Russia to attack NATO allies that are not spending enough on their militaries. And so this is why all these European countries are trying to appeal to Donald Trump. They fear Donald Trump in a way. Well, at least they're pretending to fear, or at least some of them actually are afraid of Donald Trump. I don't think the Germans really fear American non-interventionism. I don't. I think the Germans are acting as if they're fearing the possibility of a Trump presidency. But I think that the Germans see Trump as an opportunity to revive their military power, to use Trump's rhetoric as a pretext to revive Germany and to bring the band back together, if you know what I mean. And that's that. The Europeans are not acting as if Biden is going to win. The Europeans are acting as if Trump is going to win. And so the political forecast is telling us that Trump is going to win. It's as simple as that. Now, I'm not saying that it's going to happen 100%, but I will say that it's very likely that Donald Trump is going to win. And that's why you have all these Democrats saying, well, Biden needs to leave, so that in the case of a Trump victory, they can say, well, it wasn't us. We told the old bastard to leave, but he was so arrogant that he decided to drag the country down with him. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.